Picture yourself flying above France during the First Great War, the sound of your fragile craft drowning out all else. All of the world laid out before you like a canvas map. Yet this pilot is about to make his first kill, and it will be the first of many for the man who will become the ace of aces. No sooner had I altered my line of flight than the German pilot saw me leave the sun's rays. Hall was already halfway to him when he stuck up his nose and began furiously climbing to the upper ceiling. I let him pass me and found myself on the other side, just as Hall began firing. I doubt if the bocce even had seen Hall's new board at all. Surprised by discovering this new antagonist Hall ahead of him, the false immediately abandoned all idea of a battle, and banking around to the right started for home, just as I had expected him to do. In a trice I was on his tail. Down we sped with throttles both full open. Hall was coming out somewhere in my rear. The bocce had no heart for evolutions or maneuvers. He was running like a scared rabbit, as I had run from Campbell. I was gaining upon him every instant and had my sights trained dead upon his seat before I fired my first shot. At 150 yards, I pressed my triggers. The tracer bullets cut a streak of living fire into the rear of the false's tail. Raising the nose of my airplane slightly, the fiery streak lifted itself like the stream of water pouring from a garden hose. Gradually, it settled into the pilot's seat. The swerving of the false course indicated that his rudder no longer was held by a directing hand. At 2,000 feet above the enemy's lines, I pulled up my headlong dive and watched the enemy machine continuing on its course. Curving slightly to the left, the false circled a little to the south, and the next minute crashed onto the ground just at the edge of the woods, a mile inside their own lines. I had brought down my first enemy aeroplane and had not been subjected to a single shot. That was the story of American pilot Eddie Rickenbacker's first aircraft kill during World War I, taken from his book, Fighting Defying Circus. This is only one story from the life of a man that may more accurately be described as an Nazi. This is the story of Eddie Rickenbacker. Born in Columbus, Ohio on the 8th of 1890, Rickenbacker was the son of Swiss immigrants. Originally the last name Rickenbacker was spelled with a CH instead of a CK, a spelling that he later changed so as to sound less Germanic. From an early age, Rickenbacker was exposed to the hardship and challenge that would come to define a large part of his life. If anything, his childhood was defined by rebellious tendencies. He first smoked at the age of 5, and later became involved in a gang. Through this gang, he suffered a major injury at the age of 8 when he led his group down a slide in a steel cart that led into a deep gravel pit, in the process crashing and cutting open his leg to the bone. By the time he became a teenager, his father died, leaving Rickenbacker to help his mother and 7 siblings support themselves. Rickenbacker said of the death of his father, "That day, I turned from a harum-scarum youngster into a young man, serious beyond my age." During his teenage years, Rickenbacker developed an interest and passion for automobiles, which during that time was still a new and developing concept. Rickenbacker then took a job as a mechanic for a race car driver named Lee Freyer. He later began work with the Columbus Buggy Company, where in his spare time he competed in races. He won some prizes, but truly winning the heart of spectators due to his daring and exhilarating driving. This led to many crashes and close calls. However, none of this stopped him from setting a speed record of 134 miles per hour at the Daytona in 1914. However, the winds of change were coming his way, and soon he would gain wings of his own. Rickenbacker's first experience in the air was riding with a pilot named Glenn Martin, and this experience gave him a new love. Rickenbacker had a fear of heights, however this did not hinder his progress, and by 1916 he had mastered flying. When I look up and see the sun shining on the patch of white clouds up in the blue, I begin to think how it would feel to be up somewhere above it, winging swiftly through the clear air, watching the earth below and the men on it, no bigger than ants. In 1914, the Great War began, the defining event of a generation. Men and women from all backgrounds and walks of life had their worlds changed in 4 years of brutal conflict. Rickenbacker himself was embroiled in the conflict at the onset of U.S. involvement in 1917. Already planes were being used as machines of war, even though the first flight had only occurred just over a decade earlier. The planes used in combat were primitive and truly fragile machines made of wood and metal. To many, they were seen as a flying death trap, as being shot down was guaranteed death, although later in the war, parachutes would see some use. Rickenbacker got his start as a volunteer aircraft pilot, where initially he was denied. By this time he was 27, an age generally too old for military service, and had no college degree. However, he continued pushing and was finally accepted as a student pilot. Immediately he showed his aptitude for flight, and he graduated within 17 days. His first placement was as a lieutenant in the 94th Aero Squadron, where his fellow pilots, many of whom were Ivy League graduates, looked down on him. Rickenbacker continued honing his skills despite the pushback, and shot down his first enemy plane on April 29th, 1918. Almost exactly a month later, he shot down his fifth enemy plane, earning him the coveted status of ace. Throughout the rest of the war, Rickenbacker would achieve 26 victories against enemy aircraft, in the process gaining the command of his own squadron. In a series of actions in September of 1918, during which he gained his command position, Rickenbacker shot down 2 of the new German Fokker aircraft, alongside 2 other fighters in the span of 3 days. This amazing feat would earn him the Medal of Honor years after the war in 1931 by President Herbert Hoover. 300 combat hours, more than any other American pilot in the war. 26 confirmed victories. 13 German Fokker aircraft shot down. Leadership of a fighter squadron. Rickenbacker's wartime feats gained him the nickname Ace of Aces, a title he was never very fond of. However, Rickenbacker made it through the Great War, and one would assume he could lead an easy life after. They would be wrong. After the war, Rickenbacker would turn his interests once again to automobiles. In 1920, he founded the Rickenbacker Motor Company. His company would innovate with a new 4-wheel brake system. However, poor publicity from competitors would lead to even poorer sales. By 1927, the company would go bankrupt. However, Rickenbacker would make an odd decision. He insisted he would pay back the $250,000 debt that he owed. Through financial aid from a friend, he was able to get back on his feet and invested successfully in the Indianapolis Motorways stock, eventually becoming the Motorways president. His resilience was paying off, and he gained more income from the sales of his book on his experiences from the First World War, fighting the flying circus. He then would take a position with General Motors, through which he was influential in their purchase of North American aviation. He worked rigorously, and through his work he had a close brush with death in a plane crash in Georgia in 1941. Rickenbacker was trapped in the plane and covered in fuel. Perhaps channeling some of his experiences from the war, he kept in good spirits and encouraged and directed the other survivors involved in the crash to get them all out of the plane. Rescue was not able to arrive until the next morning, by which time Rickenbacker was conscious but in a bad state. Many of the rescuers did not even realize he was alive, and his death was even reported in the press. His wounds were numerous, including injuries like serious head trauma, a fractured skull, and a shattered left elbow and crushed nerve. In 1942, with the United States now embroiled in war yet again, Rickenbacker decided to support the war effort however he could. He would end up helping the War Department by traveling the world touring army bases in the U.S. and England. His goal was to convince the public to donate to the war effort, and even offered the equipment and personnel of his own company for use by the military. In October 1942, Rickenbacker was sent by President Roosevelt himself to deliver a verbal message to Douglas MacArthur, the American general in the Pacific. En route to Canton Island from Honolulu, the B-17 pilot got lost, and running low on fuel was forced to land the plane in the ocean. 8 men were on board, and only 1 was injured in the crash. The men recovered 3 rafts, fishing kits, a couple guns, and meager rations from the wreck. They managed to tie the rafts together, and thus a 22-day odyssey began. The men survived, catching rainwater in both Rickenbacker's hat and a bucket they had, catching fish, and on one occasion, a bird that landed on Rickenbacker, whose shockingly quick reflexes ended its life. Throughout the entire ordeal, the men starved, Rickenbacker himself losing 60 pounds, and 1 man would die and be buried at sea. Rickenbacker during the 3 weeks at sea was constantly trying to keep morale up through any means, which led to many of the men despising him. However, it may have contributed to their survival. Eventually the men on 3 rafts split up and were all found through various means. Rickenbacker, even after such an ordeal, insisted on continuing on to deliver his message to General MacArthur. At age 73, Rickenbacker would eventually retire, settling with his wife first at a modest ranch in Texas, then moving to New York City, and later to Coral Gables. Rickenbacker, however, would suffer a stroke there, recover, and then move to Switzerland to seek help for his now sick wife. It is there that he contracted pneumonia, and he passed away. At his funeral, the legendary James Jimmy Doolittle would give eulogy, and 4 jet fighters would fly overhead in tribute, a fitting send-off to one of the pioneers of flight. Truly, the life of Eddie Rickenbacker was one of both great adventure and hardship. There are few that can attest to having experienced even half of what he did, and fewer with such great endurance and heart. In all my time researching this man, there is one thing that stood out. An observation made by Rickenbacker from his plane over the trenches at the end of World War I. The trenches erupted. Brown uniformed men poured out of the American trenches, gray-green uniforms out from the German. From my observer's seat overhead, I watched them throw their helmets in the air, discard their guns, wave their hands. Then, all up and down the front, the 2 groups of men began edging towards each other across no man's land. Seconds before they had been willing to shoot each other, now they came forward. Hesitantly at first, then more quickly, each group approached the other. Suddenly, gray uniforms mixed with brown. I could see them hugging each other, dancing, jumping. Americans were passing out cigarettes and chocolate. Star shells, rockets, and flares began to go up. And I turned my ship towards the field. The war was over. Though they may have passed, the men and women that came before us can still teach us what it means to be human and what it means to swim through the tides of life. Let us never forget those who came before.